At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia stood as an empire that, on one hand, appeared to command endless lands, and on the other, was decaying from within. On paper, it was one of the world's greatest powers. Yet beneath the surface, a barely suppressed rebellion simmered under the weight of superficial reforms, and chaos hid behind a facade of modernization. While liberal institutions and industrialization were gaining strength in Western Europe, Russia remained trapped in an absolute monarchy, a traditional agrarian economy, and a society suspended between tradition and change. The autocratic state represented by the Romanov dynasty appeared imposing from the outside, but carried within it fragility, contradictions, and mounting tension. This tension was not solely due to the regime's slow pace of reform. It stemmed equally from the social and political structures that struggled to adapt to the transformations of the modern age. Russia's most significant transformation in the 19th century was the abolition of serfdom in 1861. Though this reform appeared to free the peasants, in practice, most were left without access to land and remained under control through the communal land system known as mir. Russian peasant was shaped by these traditional village communities. The mir system, institutionalized after the emancipation of the serfs, referred to a communal administrative and economic structure in which agricultural land was managed collectively. Land was distributed according to family size, but ownership was communal rather than individual. Each mir was led by a starosta elder elected by its members, and land redistribution was carried out every few years to maintain balance. While intended to ensure fair allocation of scarce resources, the mir system discouraged individual agricultural initiative and efficiency. Peasants could only use the land while cultivating it. They could not sell or mortgage it. This limited the modernization of Russian agriculture and its capitalist development. Mir served as a practical tool for tax collection and organizing military obligations. It also tied the rural population to the central authority and restricted social mobility. By the early 20th century, the Stolypin reforms began to dismantle this system, but mir continued to influence the social fabric of rural Russia, both as a tool of solidarity and as an obstacle to development. The old chains had been removed, only to be replaced by invisible ones. A free labor market had not developed, nor had there been a significant leap in agricultural productivity. Nevertheless, beginning in the 1890s, a new economic era began in Russia under the leadership of Finance Minister Sergei Wheat. With state-supported industrialization efforts, Wheat aimed to connect the country's east and west through massive projects such as the Trans-Siberian Railway. These initiatives opened Russia further to foreign capital. In between 1893 and 1899, more than half of all industrial investments in Russia were financed by French and Belgian investors. Yet this development was unevenly distributed across the country. While industrial sectors flourished in rising centers such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Łódź rural areas remained mired in poverty, low productivity, and heavy tax burdens. One of the main sources of revenue for the imperial treasury came from indirect taxes on vodka. This created a system in which the poorest segments of society bore the greatest share of public finance. Though Witty's policies laid the groundwork for a modern economic infrastructure, they also gave rise to waves of social unrest. Industrialization brought about the emergence of a working class that increasingly voiced demands for political representation and social security. These tensions were further inflamed by the authoritarian nature of the political system. Tsar Nicholas was an absolute monarch who believed himself to be God's representative on earth. He entered the stage of history slowly and hesitantly. He was Russia's last Tsar, perhaps its most reluctant one. Ascending to the throne in 1894 after the death of his father, Alexander, he was only 26 years old. Deeply educated and fluent in several languages, Nicholas lived more like a withdrawn aristocrat devoted to his family than a head of state. Those close to him described him as kind, emotional, and extremely shy. But this humility lacked the decisiveness and foresight required of a ruler. His personality clashed with the power his position demanded. He remained blindly loyal to a narrow circle of advisors, especially his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna and the mystic monk Rasputin, whose influence would grow strong enough to shape imperial decisions in the lead-up to war. There was always a gap between the Tsar and his people. He could not truly grasp the poverty in industrial cities, the plight of peasant farmers, or the growing conflicts within the Duma. His world was confined to the elegant palace gardens of Tsarskoye Selo. As a father, he was affectionate, as a husband loyal, but as a Tsar, he was a figure unable to sense the spirit of his times. His romantic belief in sacred autocracy kept him distant from constitutional reforms. He was a monarch weighed down by the legacy of the past, entirely opposed to parliamentary representation, constitutional balance, or political pluralism. By the late 19th century, constitutional reform movements had gained traction among Russia's intellectual circles, but the state apparatus chose suppression over change. On top of all this, in 1904, Russia entered a new war in the Far East. At the start of the 20th century, two major powers clashed in Asia: Tsarist Russia and rapidly modernizing Japan. The region in question was Manchuria and Korea territories that Russia aimed to dominate. After defeating China in the War of 1894 to 1895, Japan had begun establishing its sphere of influence there. However, following the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, an intervention by Germany, France, and Russia forced Japan to withdraw from Port Arthur. In response, Russia signed a secret treaty with China in 1896, gaining railway privileges in Manchuria. After the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, it increased its military presence in the region. When Russia leased Port Arthur in 1898, it crossed what Japan considered a red line. This port was vital to Japan's security. Diplomatic negotiations continued through 1903. Japan offered to recognize Russia's influence in Manchuria in exchange for a free hand in Korea. But Russia wanted to expand its influence in both regions. This deadlock led to a surprise attack by Japan on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before a formal declaration of war. Japan was applying its first-day victory strategy. Though the attack did not destroy the entire Russian Pacific Fleet, it inflicted serious damage. Japan's preemptive strike outraged Russian public opinion. The initial response was one of patriotic fervor. Students filled the streets, prayers were offered, and declarations of loyalty were sent to the Tsar. The Japanese War was perhaps Nicholas's last opportunity to regain the people's trust. But from the summer, as military failures mounted, enthusiasm turned into disappointment. Even the conservative press began to express admiration for Japanese discipline and bravery. Capital newspapers wrote that propaganda promising a short and victorious war had lost all credibility. The conflict began to severely damage the morale of an already burdened society. Mobilization triggered widespread unrest. In Western Russia and Poland, draft orders were met with protests and, at times, outright revolts. Pogroms against Jews erupted in cities like Odessa, Warsaw, and Gomel, often fueled by the anger of soldiers who did not want to go to the front. In some places, workers went on strike, interpreting mobilization as a death sentence for the Tsar's sake. While society in Russia began to boil over, Japanese forces advanced on land as well. One of the war's turning points came at the Battle of Mukden in Manchuria, where Japan scored a major victory over Russian forces. The defeat shattered the morale of the imperial army and pushed the political elite in St. Petersburg to consider peace. In this situation, Tsar Nicholas II played his final card. The Russian Baltic fleet made a grueling journey of thousands of miles to the region, aiming to break Japan's naval superiority and shift the tide of the war. But Japan was prepared. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet lay in wait at the Tsushima Strait. The Battle of Tsushima, which began on the morning of May 27th, would become one of the most devastating naval battles in modern history. Togo's ships, with flawless maneuvers, secured total dominance over the Russian battleships. Using the now famous T-cross maneuver, the Japanese cut off the Russian fleet and kept it under constant fire. The tactic quickly turned the battle in Japan's favor. By the end, only a handful of Russia's 38 warships survived. The rest were either sunk or surrendered. Most of the Baltic fleet was destroyed before it had even fully entered Japanese waters. With this victory, Japan gained immense prestige and took a decisive step toward becoming a global power. The events at Tsushima marked a rupture in the global balance of power. The defeat not only ended Russia's naval presence in the Pacific, but also shattered the Tsarist regime's public legitimacy. The fury that had begun to seep through the palace walls in St. Petersburg was now unstoppable. What had begun as a war pursued with dreams of an easy victory turned into a national disaster. Japan's modern weaponry and well-trained troops had defeated Russia in every battle. The Tsar's prestige was in ruins. And the seeds of the Great Revolt had already been planted. Even before the war had ended, massive strikes, marches, and peasant uprisings had begun to erupt across Russia. By mid-1905, both sides of the conflict, Russia and Japan, were growing more inclined toward peace due to mounting economic and social pressures. Japan, in particular, was running out of financial resources and could no longer sustain the cost of war. Through the mediation of US President Theodore Roosevelt, both parties agreed to peace talks held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in August 1905. As a result of these negotiations, Russia renounced its rights in southern Manchuria and recognized Japan's dominance over Korea. Following the war, Russia was left in a highly volatile state. Under mounting pressure, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to issue the October Manifesto, which led to the establishment of the Duma. For the first time, the people would gain some form of political representation. However, this development was quickly placed within boundaries drawn by the regime. The fundamental laws adopted in 1906 severely curtailed the powers of the Duma and reaffirmed the Tsar's absolute authority in the legislative process. In short order, the Duma became a symbolic institution, stripped of real influence and incapable of exerting authority over the military or imperial bureaucracy. Still, this period saw opposition movements become more institutionalized and widespread. The socialist revolutionaries gained traction among the peasantry, while the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks grew stronger in large industrial cities. Underground pamphlets and union organizing became increasingly common. The workers' movements began to stage actions explicitly aimed at political representation and regime change. The political environment had opened up in form, but remained repressive in substance. And this suppressed arena would, in time, lay the groundwork for an even more explosive uprising. The Tsarist regime relied heavily on its army to maintain internal control. Since the second half of the 19th century, military academies had been expanded, officer training had been modernized. But these modernization efforts were far from complete when the catastrophic defeat against Japan deeply damaged the reputation of both the Russian military and the monarchy. Worse days were not far off for the Tsar. The closed nature of the political system began to create space for radical movements to flourish. The Socialist Revolutionaries, Mensheviks, and especially the Bolsheviks were becoming increasingly powerful. The working class was no longer just dissatisfied with factory conditions, it had grown disillusioned with the system itself. In cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, strikes became part of daily life. As these labor strikes combined with the growing organization of Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, a wave of social radicalization began to erode the foundations of the regime. The industrial proletariat was developing political consciousness, while the rural masses began demanding land reform. According to the 1897 census, only 13% of Russia's population lived in urban areas, an indication of how limited the base of modernization truly was. As if all this were not enough, alarm bells were also ringing in Russia's foreign policy. The Russo-German rapprochement that had begun under Bismarck's alliance system collapsed with Kaiser Wilhelm's Weltpolitik. The Three Emperors League, orchestrated by Bismarck, had sought to balance Austria against Russia while keeping France diplomatically isolated. But Germany's new leadership abandoned this approach. In 1890, Germany chose not to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. German officials viewed Russia as a dangerous but manageable neighbor. But Russia was in no mood to accept such treatment. Germany's decision marked a clear shift in its eastern policy. In response, Russia turned immediately toward France, which had long sought an alliance with the Russian Empire. This diplomatic courtship culminated in the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, a development that would dramatically shift Europe's balance of power. Germany now faced the looming possibility of a two-front war. From the Russian perspective, German activities in the Balkans conducted through Austria-Hungary were increasingly seen as expansionist and threatening. Especially after its defeat in the Far East, Russia began refocusing its attention on nearby regions, particularly the Balkans. Citing historical, cultural, and religious ties with the Orthodox Slavic peoples of the Balkans, Russia positioned itself as their natural protector. Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Slavic communities were. In contrast, Austria-Hungary, an empire that ruled over large Slavic populations in territories like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, viewed Russian support for Slavic nationalism as an internal threat. Despite these rising tensions, Russia and Austria reached a secret agreement in 1897 to preserve the status quo in the Balkans. Russia faced another persistent issue: the Ottoman Empire. The long-standing conflict with the Ottomans concealed major crises, one of the most important being the question of the Straits. For Russia, the issue was both military and economic. Grain and industrial goods exported from Black Sea ports reached European markets via the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. As such, any closure or foreign control of the Straits posed a grave threat to Russian interests. Even the brief closure of the Straits by the Ottoman Empire during the Balkan Wars of 1912 severely disrupted the Russian economy. The Black Sea coast is the lung of Russian trade, and the straits are its only airway. For Russia, gaining control over this region had become a necessity. Yet despite these ambitions, Russia took care not to enter direct conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The Anglo-Russian Convention acted as a restraining force on the Tsar. Keen to preserve the newly forged balance with its British ally, Russia opted to wait for the right moment. Maintaining the status quo in relations with the Ottoman Empire, and even allowing it to remain weak, was seen as more advantageous to Russian interests. In other words, Russia did not want the Ottomans to collapse completely, but preferred them to survive in a weakened, manageable state. But as the Ottoman Empire began drawing closer to Germany, the equilibrium started to unravel. German influence in Istanbul grew particularly through projects like the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which deeply alarmed Russia. Germany's prominent role in reorganizing the Ottoman military and the increasing involvement of German officers fueled growing Russian anxieties about the future of the Straits. This entire structure was a harbinger of collapse. A vast empire was trying to maintain traditional despotism alongside the institutions of a modern state-controlling society from the top down. Yet neither the economy, nor the political system, nor the military, nor the society itself had the resilience to sustain such pressure. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was still a great power on paper, but inside, it harbored a fragile, fragmented, and explosive reality. Beneath its surface grandeur lay deep cracks, and over time, the empire would become unable to bear the weight of its own contradictions. The empire, grown under the shadow of the Tsars, no longer possessed the flexibility to simultaneously respond to the demands of the people and its own internal tensions. Slow-moving reforms, suppressed opposition, and widening inequality had turned Russia into a simmering cauldron. And it would not be long before the lid blew off.